Thank you very much, and great to have a great introduction from Robert. So hopefully I won't have to explain too much what SIMM is, but I think it's still, I'll do a little bit of recap. So today I'm going to recap what SIMM is in context of the capital model, and I think it's always important to see, highlight the differences. I'll talk about how you backtest a capital model in relation to a margin model. Because actually here I'm going to talk about now the governance of the model. Nomura actually is a phase 1 firm, so we'll now be using for just over a year. In talking about backtesting, sorry, it is an old topic, which means we can draw from a lot of experience from backtesting VAR, so we can draw a lot of that from that, but we did make some modifications. The important one, and we classified them in terms of A and B type of backtesting, which to help test the model effectively. Then we're going to talk about a little bit of technical stuff, more about how we can improve the statistics by using overlapping windows, some technical aspects of that. And then the more recent work done in collaboration with ISDA through the industry forum called the SIMM governance framework, while we're looking at how do we maintain such a model going forward, given that it's an industry model. It's not a firm's own model. Okay, so before embarking on the governance, let's quickly go through maybe some key differences between initial margin model and a capital model. Here focusing on the counterparty exposure models is the equivalent, as Robert was explaining, and the interplay between them. But just as a reminder, a margin model is the defaulting counterparty is paying for that, because it's paying collateral, and if it defaults, it's available for the surviving counterparty. And it's important, of course, when talking about initial margin, that we agree. There's a reconciliation is a key aspect of initial margin, which is why the model had to be an industry model. It doesn't have to be regulation. You could choose your own model, but you would not work very well like that. A capital model, as I mentioned, is the surviving counterparty pays for that. So basically, you're calculating how much you would lose in the event of a default. So normally, you use a Monte Carlo engine, calculate exposure default, and then you have a capital calculator. But as most of you are familiar with, at least the internal capital calculator, as the IMM, is a proprietary model usually, and there's no need for reconciliation, is what we calculate. Of course, regulators may like some harmonization in the calculation, but we don't have to compare to a counterparty, where it's a crucial difference. So which is why SIMM had to be developed, and SIMM is a standardized internal model method. I mean, that was pretty crucial. Like I said, we're now at the stage where phase 2 firms join in, which is the case Robert mentioned. We've been a phase 1 firm, so we've been using this for a while. As a reminder, SIMM was adopted from FRTB, the SBA approach, because it was a nice model that help with the standardization of it, and also it's a simple enough model, yet risk sensitive. And it didn't belong to any individual firm, which is a crucial point, because I don't think we would ever agree if we had to use a model developed by an individual firm. Backtesting, like I said, why reinvent the wheel? There's a lot of experience in backtesting, in market risk, counterparty risk as well. So here I try to kind of just highlight some of the differences of how we use backtesting today in capital models versus what we've now been doing with SIMM. Value risk model is probably the simplest. Most firms, they'll have to conduct backtesting every day, although we may report it monthly or quarterly. And what happens when you fail backtesting? Usually, you can have a capital multiplier. In fact, it's very prescriptive in the market risk of capital multipliers. And usually in the event of going to kind of so-called amber or red zone in the multiplier, you also have to make a model update. But that's okay, because firms own their own model, by and large. Counterparty exposure, similar, although it's more involved with backtesting, so normally done quarterly. But once again, the corrective action, capital multiplier, model change. So how does that work with SIMM? Because it's not belong to an individual firm. So obviously, we still have to do some sort of monitoring. So firms are required by regulators to do their own monitoring, because we need to make sure that we're always calling for enough collateral. So we do our own backtesting. But at the firm level, we don't really have the ability to change the model. But we could, but we would not work. We will not reconcile with their counterparties, and yeah, it just does not work like that. So we'd have to, the only mechanism we have is margin multipliers. As far as I'm aware today, hasn't not been a need for any margin multipliers between two dealers, but it could happen in the future. At the global level, though, if we were to see systemically important issues of material type, maybe so like it wasn't a one-off, we would want to do perhaps a model update. Of course, we can't do that all the time, so probably have to think of an annual approach to that. So how would you upgrade the model? In fact, December this year, we're about to launch version 2 of SIMM based on recalibration and addressing some minor model modifications. But once again, it's a key difference between the SIMM and the capital model. So let's recap briefly what backtesting is about, because we're going to adopt this. Like I said, fortunately, in the market risk, we've been running backtesting for the last 20 years. Fairly prescriptive on market risk. We normally run it a one-day VAR against a one-day P&L over 250 days, and usually have a prescribed multiplier table for when we start exceeding so-called the numbers in the green zone. So it's up to 4 exceptions in a year, is so-called the green zone. Then you get into this kind of a uncertainty zone, and then eventually red zone with the models clearly failing, and the multiplier keeps on cranking up. So fairly straightforward, objective, and we can borrow from this. In fact, the key thing is that you try to address type 1 and type 2 errors, and this concept of a red, amber, green is what we can borrow. So how do we do that within a framework of SIMM? Actually, here's where we choose some slight variations on the backtesting that will help maintain the model. Type A is what we call is just a standard one, which I just described. Maybe A for actual, you can think of it like that. Here we're backtesting an equivalent one-day initial margin against a one-day P&L. So I might ask, why would you want to actually test one day? Because the margin is a 10-day margin, with a 10-day margin period of risk. It's the same reason why for VAR, today at least, the capital is based on a 10-day market move, but we'll compare it against one day. So why is it that we do that? Regulators 20 years ago realized there's some problems in trying to calculate the hypothetical P&L over a 10-day horizon, because there'd be trades that expire, there'll be a new trade. It's a very messy endeavor. And in fact, some firms have tried to do that, maybe just one firm right now, and it's fraught with problems, because you have to filter out all the intraday trading, expirations, et cetera. So probably not a good idea, and not only that, if you're using 10-day, unless you're using overlapping window, you lose statistical power. So yeah, the simplest thing was to test the model with a one-day P&L against a one-day equivalent SIMM. So we call this type A1. A1 is for one day. But we thought, how can we test the model more efficiently across the dealer community, or at least for now, the phase 1 firms, and also ensuring that we're testing against 10 days. So here we thought of a so-called type B backtesting, where we freeze the portfolio. So here, instead of allowing the portfolio to move every day, and we have an evolving sort of dynamic portfolio where we test against the margin call at that time, we freeze the portfolio that day, and then you subject the portfolio to market shocks. So that means you can now more easily reconcile the portfolio, because it's frozen in one day. You can call it more representative. And also, it's easier to generate more data, because you don't have to recover the portfolio from the past. So we can apply historical shocks as far back as you'd like. And in fact, in the early days, we applied going back to early 2008. Now, we've now converged to running it with a one-year stress test year, which will be primarily 2008, and the most recent years, 3 years in the time window. We'll call this B10 because it's type B test with a 10-day horizon. So these are the two key tests that we're now using as a standardized approach of monitoring SIMM across the industry with some minor variations. But it was important also that we agreed on a standard, because the moment we want to compare a standard model, because that itself was difficult to achieve. So now we have a standard model, if you want to monitor that in unison to agree on whether the model is not working or not, we need to also standardize the testing. That's my view anyway, and I think that's how it's coming out in practice. So just very briefly, this is a bit of a technical bit. If you want to now test the 10-day backtesting test, obviously the original prescription from Basel doesn't quite work, has to be generalized. But like I said, all we're doing is adapting the red, amber, green approach to a different type of test, because now we have overlapping windows. And when you have overlapping windows, they're no longer independent. So there's quite a bit of codependency on that, and we can adjust for that. I won't go into that, but the point here is that you can adjust the red and the green zones to the overlapping window. That's just to point out that the power of the test, actually, you can think of it in terms of standard deviation of the exception count in the mean. And the point of doing this is to show this is that if you didn't use overlapping windows for 10 days, essentially you're losing, in effect 10 times less data. Imagine if you have only 250 days and you have 10 days non-overlapping, you end up with only 25 independent samples. The power of the test goes down dramatically. And there's just a simple form of just from using by Bernoulli distribution. You can look at that by just looking at statistical books. But the way around that is that we can actually use overlapping windows and try to improve, basically reduce that number. You want to reduce the standard deviation to improve the power of the test. Actually, it turns out if you use overlapping windows, you can no longer use a simple formula, but it's a more complicated formula that shows in the red graph, the red curve there. And I have to apologize for the typo here. That should be A1, it should be B10. But the point here is that what I'm showing is that if I can compare the bottom curve, which is the standard VAR test, and you can see for 250 days, I'm plotting the power of the test, which is on the y-axis. To get the same power, if I use non-overlapping window, I need 10 times more data, which is what you see here. I need 2,500 data points. The middle curve is what happens if I use overlapping window. So what it means is that with overlapping window, I can recover some of the power with only about 1,000 data points instead of 10,000. Oh, sorry, 1,000 instead of 2,500. Which means I can effectively recover the same power of doing the one-year test, the one-day P&L, using 4 years. So that's a useful outcome, which means that when doing the test with the 10-day overlapping window, if I have 4 years worth of data, I have the same statistics as using 1 year with the 1 day. So just kind of show some equivalence. And here, just kind of summarize the two types of tests. The main focus is A1. That's the test we would do if we're using every day, 1 day P&L against the evolving portfolio, and versus 10-day overlapping. And here I'm saying I'm using 4 years of data equivalent, so to keep the same power of the test. But there are two types of tests, as I highlight here. One uses dynamic, the other was a reference state. And they're kind of complementary, but certainly the one that's B10, what I freeze the portfolio, is the one that we preferably use when making comparisons across the industry, because you can freeze a portfolio, and so it's easier to reconcile information across firms. Actually, more recently, we've been trying to work with the regulatory community to see how we can best use this type of backtesting we just discussed in a way to govern the model. Like I said, every firm has to do their own monitoring. We ought to do backtesting. But also we need to find some way of communicating that in an efficient way to the regulators. I don't think the regulators would want to see, for example, right now there's about 25 firms that have between phase 1 and phase 2. I don't think they want to see reports from 25 firms on how the model is performing. There'll be a lot of duplication. And if you can imagine, as the subsequent phases come along, we don't want to keep on duplicating over and over again the amount of information coming to the regulators. It's not efficient, it does not make much sense. So what we've been doing since the inception of the model, we've created this governance forum through ISDA. And well, at least what the US regulators are saying is that they want to go to one source for information of the performance of SIMM. They go to ISDA, and what ISDA does, it aggregates the monitoring done by individual firms. So actually on a quarterly basis, we send our backtesting reports through ISDA. We agreed on the format, we agree what we're going to report, and then we create a quarterly report that we agreed to, send it to the regulators. And then once a year, we do a more coherent test, and then we check if the model needs updating. We will look at the recalibration of the model and do a coordinated backtesting with all the new model. So that's going to work kind of converging with the regulators as more of a sensible governance going forward. In fact, last week, some of us, including Tomo Kodama, sitting on the back, one of the colleagues helped design this, and to discuss with the US regulators. Unfortunately, we have not yet done that with other regulators, like the European regulators, but I think it would be good to be able to do that. But essentially, last week, we talked to the US regulators and see if we can agree on this approach. And I think we're converging on that, which is, I think it's a good thing. And going forward, we also have to think how can we make the process scalable as we bring phase 4 firms, phase 3, phase 4 firms, and because we want to make the process continue to be efficient, and the focus should continue to be on addressing model issues that are more systemic. That means they affect multiple firms, not just one firm. We want to address model issues to the extent that they are material, and to the extent that they are not transient issues. Because you can argue that if there was a individual firm with an individual portfolio, which could happen, that there was a shortfall, you should be able to address it through the mechanism of multipliers. But to change a whole model, that affects the whole industry. Because every time you change a model, you have to go at the whole industry, you have to coordinate themselves to release the next model. So to do that, we need to be pretty subjective or objective in when we're going to make the change and when there's a problem. So in summary, I believe we've now converged into what we think is a sensible approach to monitoring the performance of SIMM. Like I said, we've converged on two types of backtesting. One is what we call it maybe the standard value risk type backtesting, which is still being used today. In fact, even on the FRTB, we'll continue to do this kind of backtesting over 1 day, although possibly with 2 confidence levels, but we can still continue to be based on 1 day P&L. So this, I think, is important to maintain. And the other one, which is kind of more of a novel way of doing backtesting, is where you freeze a portfolio and you subject the portfolio to market shocks, and then you can go back in time and including periods of stress. In fact, right now we're kind of proposing using 1 year of stress and 3 of the more recent years, which is kind of more aligned to also how the model is calibrated. And like I said, we have to also generalize the test to effectively allow for the effect you have overlapping windows with a 10-day overlapping window backtesting. I was probably too fast, but allows plenty of questions.